Late one afternoon in December of 1986, a woman named Shanti Singh was sitting on her bed cradling her toddler son, whose name was T2, as he threw a huge temper tantrum. T2, who was 3 years old, had already been throwing this tantrum for about 30 minutes at this point, and it didn't seem like anything Shanti did was getting him to calm down. In fact, honestly, it just seemed like T2 was getting worse and worse by the second. And Shanti knew her son's constant wailing must be annoying her neighbors in the little rural village in northern India where they lived. But again, Shanti just felt like really there was nothing she could do. After all, this was not a typical toddler tantrum. T2 was not throwing this tantrum because he lost a toy or was fighting with his siblings or something. No, the reality was Shanti and her husband had no idea why T2 was throwing this tantrum, because T2 threw these tantrums all the time for seemingly no reason, and nothing they did would get him to stop. He would just start throwing these crazy fits, and he would only stop when he was ready. Now, Shanti and her husband had taken T2 to the local doctor, and he'd been examined, and the doctor said, "Look, I think your son's just fine. I can't find anything wrong with him. So whatever's causing him to be so upset, it's got to be psychological." Shanti grabbed her son and tried to give him a hug and kiss to get him to calm down. But as she did that, T2 turned around and tried to hit her in the face and kicked her and punched her. And so Shanti had to kind of fall back on the bed. And T2 at this point, who's still throwing this huge tantrum, he leapt off the bed and ran out of the room. Now, Shanti had already sent the rest of her family, her kids, her husband, outside to wait out this current T2 tantrum. And so for a second, Shanti thought about just laying on the bed and letting her crazy toddler just kind of run around the house until he was done throwing this tantrum. But as Shanti was laying there on the bed, practically crying from frustration, she heard a plate break in the kitchen. And so she jumped up and ran into the kitchen, and there was T2 looking down at the ground where there was a shattered plate on the ground. Clearly, T2 had smashed it on purpose. And so as furious as Shanti was, she suddenly realized that, nothing she could do was going to get this kid to stop. And so right now, the only thing she could do was just put him in a safe place where he couldn't hurt other people or himself or damage anything else. And so Shanti, trying to be as calm as possible, walked up to T2, who's still throwing this tantrum and swinging at her as she's coming near him. And she grabbed him, she turned him around so he couldn't kick her or punch her. She put him into his room and then shut the door. And then she sat down in the hallway with her back up against the door to keep it shut. And then as T2 inside the room began banging on the door and trying to open it, Shanti's sitting there anchoring the door, and she's just praying that her son's gonna calm down soon. And then at some point, Shanti heard her son start to say something that typically signaled the end of a tantrum. T2 in the bedroom began saying the word Shurshverma, which actually was a nonsense word that Shanti and her husband and the other kids had no idea what it meant. But, T2, at the end of his tantrums, he would always just start saying over and over again, Shurshverma, Shurshverma, Shurshverma. And so Shanti, she's in the hall and she's hearing T2 start to do that. And so on the one hand, she's thinking, okay, this tantrum's about to end. But on the other, she's like, I have no idea what that word means. It's obviously connected in some way to what's going on with my son, but I have no idea what it means. It sounds like nonsense. And so Shanti began yelling through the door at T2 to explain what Shurshverma meant, but T2 had no explanation. He just kept saying the word over and over again, Shurshverma, Shurshverma, Shurshverma. Shanti and her husband had 5 other kids. T2 was the youngest, and T2 was not like any of his other siblings. The other siblings did not throw temper tantrums like this, not at all. And in fact, T2 had been a difficult child even before he was born. Towards the end of Shanti's pregnancy with T2, she'd become very, very sick, and in fact had to be hospitalized for the entire last trimester. And then as a newborn baby, T2 basically didn't sleep at all, and he cried constantly. And so Shanti and her husband initially thought, T2 must just be a very fussy baby. But in time, as he grew into more of a toddler, it was clear to Shanti and her husband that T2 was actually a different kind of kid. He seemed like a very unhappy and kind of angry kid who was permanently on the verge of crying or throwing a fit. But it wasn't until T2 began talking at around 2 years old that Shanti and her husband really started to become worried. because the things T2 was saying as a 2-year-old were just not in keeping with what you would expect a 2-year-old to say. And I'm not talking about the nonsense word that T2 would use during his temper tantrums, Shurshverma. Basically, T2 would say things that seemed to indicate that he genuinely hated everyone in his family. Now, for context, Shanti and her family were not poor, but they weren't rich either. They lived in a little concrete home, they didn't have a TV or a car, and all the kids wore hand-me-down clothes, and Shanti actually handmade her clothes and her husband's clothes. But the family always had enough food to eat, and they were educated, and they seemed happy enough. It's just that they didn't really have the ability to do anything extra, like above and beyond a modest life. And Titu had never known anything different. This was his life from the day he was born. But when he learned to speak at around 2 years old, it was like all Titu wanted to talk about was how crappy of a lifestyle their family lived. For example, when Titu's mom, Shanti, would put on one of her saris that happened to be ripped, a sari is a traditional garment in India, Titu would look at what she was wearing, and in toddler speak, he would tell her that she looked terrible and that it looked like she was just wearing rags. Titu would also walk around their house and he would point to spots in the house that looked dirty, and he would demand that somebody cleaned it up because he didn't want to live in a dirty house. And then whenever the family needed to go somewhere and they would walk there or take the bus there, Titu would complain the entire time that he wanted to be in a car, and why aren't we driving in a car? Like, why are we walking? Despite the fact that Titu basically had never used a car before. But perhaps the strangest aspect of Titu's behavior was around the time he began talking and insulting his family, he also began talking about this very historic city called Agra, which was located about 8 miles away from where they lived. Agra was famous for being home to the Taj Mahal, which is considered to be one of the most beautiful buildings ever made. Agra also has a very busy downtown and lots of tourism, but Titu had never been to Agra, and there was no reason he would be drawn to Agra, like his family had no connection to that city. But starting around the time Titu began talking at 2 years old, he began asking to go to Agra several times a week. And when his parents would say, no, we're not going to go to Agra, Titu would throw a huge tantrum. And so not long after Titu had begun speaking and saying all these terrible things, Shanti and her husband decided that really all they could do was just wait and hope their son grew out of this terrible behavior. But Titu did not grow out of this. Shortly after his parents decided to just kind of wait it out, Titu would randomly attack another small child with a sugarcane, and he beat the kid so badly the kid was bleeding at the end of the attack. And then also another time, shortly after the sugarcane beating, Titu was at the store with his mother, and his mom was looking at this bracelet, which she couldn't afford. She was just looking at it through the glass, and Titu sensed his mom wanted the bracelet, and in an odd show of affection for his mother, he turned to the shopkeeper, this little tiny kid who's not even 3 years old yet, and he tells the shopkeeper that if he doesn't give this bracelet to his mother for free, that Titu will shoot and kill the shopkeeper. And so after this, Shanti and her husband just stopped taking Titu out in public at all. It was just too embarrassing. But what really just unsettled Shanti the most about her son's behavior was that nonsense word that Titu kept saying at the end of all of his tantrums, Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma. And so fast forward to that day after he's broken the plate and now Shanti's put him in his room, Titu began saying that nonsense word, except he was getting a little bit older and his speech was getting a little bit more clear. And so as Shanti was laying up against the door, she realized that her son was not saying a single word, Shursh Verma, he was saying 2 words. They were Suresh Varma. But Shanti had no idea what that meant. She thought it sounded like a name, but it was a name she had never heard before. But one day, a few months after the dish-breaking incident, in April of 1987, all of Titu's very strange, erratic, terrible behaviors would erupt all at once. That April day started out like any other. Shanti made breakfast for her family, and then her husband headed out to do some errands, and her 6 children kind of dispersed around the inside and outside of the house to play, study, whatever. But Titu was really grouchy, and so he stayed inside in the kitchen with Shanti. A little while later, Shanti's oldest son came into the kitchen and he asked his mother, hey, when will Dad get back from his trip to Agra? Shanti's husband had gone to Agra to run one of his chores, and Agra was the city that Titu was totally obsessed with. And so when Shanti's oldest son said the word Agra, T2, who was sitting in the kitchen, he heard it and kind of looked up like he was totally fixated on their conversation. And then as Shanti and her oldest were talking about the dad, T2 just got up, left the kitchen, and he went to his room. He grabbed a couple of things, and then he came back into the kitchen carrying this bundle of clothes with him. And he walked right past his brother and his mother. He went out the front door and began running down the road without saying a word. Remember, this is like a 3-year-old child. This is not a teenager. This is a little kid. And so Shanti and her oldest son, they kind of watched in shock as T2 ran off down the road. And for a minute, neither of them did anything. And then it was like they broke out of their trance, and the oldest son just turned and began running out of the house to catch up with T2. Now, it didn't take long for the oldest to catch up with his young brother, but it was surprisingly hard to stop T2 from trying to run away. He fought back as hard as he could to keep his brother from pulling him back to the house. And then when the older brother got T2 back inside, Shanti looked at her older son and she saw he had a black eye from where T2 had just hit him. And when Shanti turned to T2 to try to get him to apologize to his brother for hitting him, she saw T2 was completely inconsolable. He was throwing a huge temper tantrum. He was on the ground kicking and flailing and screaming at the top of his lungs. And so Shanti and her oldest son knew there was no hope in getting him to calm down. He was deep into one of his tantrums. And so Shanti and the oldest just basically restrained T2 so he couldn't hurt himself or one of them or damage anything. And for a while, as they held him to the ground, T2 just continued to scream and flail and throw this fit. But eventually he did kind of calm down and he began saying Suresh Verma over and over again. But then he began talking about something that he really hadn't brought up before that stood out to Shanti and her oldest son. T2, in addition to saying periodically Suresh Verma, also began talking about some radio store in Agra. And T2 kept saying, why didn't Dad bring me to the radio store? Why didn't he bring me? And so as Shanti is listening to her son, she suddenly thinks, you know what? This is my chance. He's being so specific about this radio store. You know, maybe this is my opportunity to lean in and learn what the heck is going on with my kid. And so once T2 fully stopped his temper tantrum and Shanti and her oldest could finally let go of him, once T2 had left the room, Shanti turned to her oldest son and she told him to go to Agra right now. Just go there and look for a radio store or something. Look for anything that could be a clue to what's going on with T2. He obviously has some fixation with the city. Just go, look around, see if you can find something. So the oldest son left the house and he went to one of his friends' houses who had a car, and together they drove into Agra. Now, Shanti had no idea if her oldest son's trip to Agra would produce anything useful, but she figured, you know, she's got nothing to lose. A few hours later, when Shanti's oldest son returned from Agra, he came into their home with a very serious look on his face. And right away, Shanti could tell, clearly, he's discovered something. And so Shanti asked her oldest son, you know, tell me, what did you learn? What happened in Agra? And the oldest son, you know, he looked down for a second, and then he looked back at his mom and he just said, tomorrow, we're going to have visitors. Are you a fan of The Strange, Dark, and Mysterious? If so, then you're in luck. Because our massively popular show, the MrBallen podcast, which since the end of 2022 has been exclusively on the Amazon Music platform, is now available on all podcast platforms, and it's free. There are over 200 episodes in the back catalog of this show. And of those 200, at least half of them have never been told on YouTube. They are only available on the podcast. And you can find those exclusive episodes by looking for the words podcast exclusive in the individual episode title. So again, the highly popular MrBallen podcast is once again available on all podcast platforms, and it is free. To listen, just search for the MrBallen podcast on Amazon Music or wherever else you get your podcasts, and then give the show a follow and then start your binge. Oh, and also, if you are one of the amazing people who subscribe to Amazon Music to follow the MrBallen podcast when it went exclusive, don't give up your membership just yet, because there are still huge perks for listening to the show on Amazon Music. With your Prime membership, you can listen to new episodes of the MrBallen podcast 30 days early and ad-free on Amazon Music. But again, the show is now available on all podcast platforms, and it really is free. So, thank you so much. Have a nice binge. The next day, a car pulled up in front of Shanti's home and 6 people climbed out. There was a woman wearing a beautiful red sari who appeared to be in her 30s, and then there were 3 other men who also appeared to be in their 30s, and they were all wearing suits and jackets. And there was also an older couple, a man and a woman, and the man was wearing this beautiful sweater, and the woman had on all this silk. It was clear, just from the way they looked, that these 6 people were not from this area. They were from somewhere else, and they had a ton of money. Now, Shanti was inside the house, and she was watching this group arrive, but she did not go outside to greet them. She, her husband, and all of her kids, minus T2, had decided the night before, when they knew these visitors were going to arrive, that they wouldn't go out and talk to them. Instead, they would just allow T2 to basically make first contact with these people and see what happens. So when Shanti saw this group of 6 very well-off people were standing right outside of their gate, kind of waiting to be let in, she called for T2 and said, "Hey, go outside and open the gate for our guests." And so T2, who was not throwing a fit at this point, he came running through the house and he went to the door. He's not looked outside yet. He opens up the door and he runs outside and he sees these 6 people on the other side of the gate. And suddenly Shanti heard T2 make a sound that he never made. It was like the sound of pure joy. He was so elated to see these 6 people. Shanti couldn't believe it. For a second, Shanti closed her eyes and almost started crying because she knew, even before T2 had made that joyous sound when he saw these people, they were about to solve the mystery of what was going on with her son. Just then, Shanti heard T2 from outside yelling for Shanti and the rest of his family to come outside and meet his other family. Shanti went to the door and gestured for the guests to come inside, and then she led them through the house to the back deck. And then after they were all seated, Shanti looked over at her son, T2, and she saw he had this huge grin on his face. He was so happy, and he was staring intently at the woman who got out of the car, who was in her 30s and wearing the beautiful red sari, and she was sitting right across the table from T2, and T2 is just locked on her. Now, at this point, nobody is speaking. Everybody is just sitting there. No introductions have been made, so nobody even knows each other's names. And in this kind of tense and awkward silence, T2, who again is just staring at this woman in red, he eventually breaks the silence, the 3-year-old child, and he asks the woman in red to come sit next to him. And so the woman in the red sari, she does what he asks and moves over and sits next to the toddler. And then T2 looked up at her and he smiled and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And the woman, she's looking down at him and she said, "No, I don't." And T2 would look back up at her and he would say, "I know who you are. You're Uma." And at this, the woman in red, whose name really was Uma, she gasped. She had no idea how this kid knew who she was. But before she could even say anything, T2 continued. And he said to her, "Hey, do you remember when we went to the fair with Ranu and Sanu and I bought you those sweets?" And at this, the woman in the red sari, Uma, she had this new look come over her face. Instead of looking like she was just kind of shocked and appalled that this random kid knew who she was, now it was like a look of shocked recognition as she's looking down at T2, like she suddenly understood what was actually going on. And at the same time, T2's mother, Shanti, was watching this happen, and she was kind of piecing together what was really going on here, and suddenly she realized she needed to check something. And she got up and she ran out of the room and she came back with scissors. And without saying anything, Shanti went straight to T2, she pushed his head to the side, exposing his right ear, and she used those scissors and began cutting all the hair off his head that was kind of drooped over his right ear, kind of exposing the right side of his skull. And as the hair on T2's head fell to the ground, exposing more and more of the right side of his head, all the adults watching just gasped. And the whole time, T2 was just smiling. To understand what just happened out on that back porch between these random people and Shanti and her family, you need some context. So here's what happened when Shanti's oldest son was sent to Agra to go investigate and look for clues that could explain what was going on with T2. The brother and his friend had driven all around Agra, looking for radio stores and looking for things that might in some way kind of connect to T2, and they didn't see anything. But at some point, they drove past one of the many radio stores in Agra, and the name of this radio store immediately stood out to the brother and this friend. So the older brother and the friend, they parked their car and they went into this particular radio shop, and inside of there is where they met Uma, the woman who had the red sari on, who was in her 30s, that T2 said we went to the fair together with, that woman. So she's inside this radio shop, and when the older brother asked Uma how this radio shop got its name, that was when things began to fall into place for this older brother about what was going on with T2. Uma would tell the older brother that this radio shop actually belonged to her husband, except 3.5 years ago, he was murdered. He was shot and killed, and so she had been running the shop ever since. And Uma said she had considered changing the name of the shop, since taking it over, but she just couldn't bring herself to change it because the shop's name was actually based on her husband's name. The name of the shop was Suresh Radio Shop. Her husband's name was Suresh Verma, the two words that T2 would say all the time at the end of his tantrums. Suresh Verma, Suresh Verma. That was Uma's husband. And it would turn out the details of Suresh's death matched up in a very bizarre way with T2's birth. And all of T2's totally erratic, strange, terrible behavior throughout really his entire life to this point now suddenly made sense if you knew about Suresh's life. Many people, including professors from major universities in India and America, have come to believe that what happened with T2 was when Suresh was murdered, his spirit somehow came out of his body and entered T2's body. Basically, Suresh was reincarnated in T2. This reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was always saying Suresh Verma, because in theory that was his real name. That's the guy who died, who then his spirit transitioned to T2, so he's saying his name over and over again. And then also T2's obsession with Agra would make sense, because that's where Suresh's radio shop was and where he lived. Also, the reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was so critical of Shanti and the rest of his family's lifestyle, basically accusing them of being poor and kind of living below his station. Well, Suresh's family was very, very wealthy, and so that was the lifestyle Suresh had lived. And so if his spirit was now in T2's body, he might be at odds with their lifestyle. And lastly, the reincarnation theory would explain the two very unique and very pronounced birthmarks that T2 had right next to his right ear. He had one right above his right ear and right below it. Now, these were birthmarks that Shanti was well aware of, but after she learned about how Suresh Verma was killed, he was shot in the side of his head, and the bullet went in above his right ear and then came out on the bottom part of his right ear, right here. When she heard that, she ran and got the scissors. She cut the hair away around T2's ear, revealing the two birthmarks. And then the other families saw those birthmarks, and they're like, oh my goodness, that is literally where the entry and exit wounds were on Suresh. And then also, it's worth pointing out that on the day Suresh was shot and killed, well, basically that day was when T2's mother, Shanti, began feeling really sick during her pregnancy with T2, and she had to be hospitalized. After this discovery about T2 and Suresh Verma, Shanti and her husband and the rest of her family expected T2 to want to live with Uma and his other family. And at first, that is what T2 wanted to do, but pretty quickly he actually decided that, you know what, I want to stay put with the family I was born into, and we can just visit with the other family. And so that's what they did. Uma and the other wealthy family, they made visits all the time to see T2 and vice versa. The families got along great. And as for T2, he was really happy. His bad behavior basically went away and he became a normal, high-functioning kid. And T2 has grown up and become a very happy and successful adult. He's got a family of his own, and he's currently a professor at a college in India. On the morning of February 8th, 2010, 17-year-old Mackenzie Cowell was sitting in her high school cafeteria in Wenatchee, Washington. Wenatchee was a small agricultural town nicknamed the apple capital of the world because of its thousands of acres of sprawling apple orchards in the area. And in the cafeteria, Mackenzie was sitting around a long table with her high school dance team, the Applettes, that was named after the town's biggest crop. Mackenzie loved dancing almost more than anything. And even when she wasn't doing routines with the dance team at football and basketball games, she would often dance her way down the halls to class or out to her car in the school parking lot. And as a high school senior, she was one of the leaders of the Applettes. And so she and some of the other seniors were talking about the new sweatshirts they wanted to design for the dance team. The girls talked about the different images they could put on the shirts and what color they should be. Mackenzie voted for her favorite color, purple. And then they just relaxed and talked about other things that were going on in their lives, like the boys they were dating, SAT scores, and what they wanted to do that weekend. Then the morning bell rang, and Mackenzie and the other girls grabbed their school bags, got up from the table, and headed to class. Mackenzie was 5 foot 8 inches tall, and she was pretty with long brown hair and red highlights. And she had braces on her teeth that she couldn't wait to get off. But even though her braces made her self-conscious, they didn't stop her from smiling at the other students she passed in the hall. And she knew the braces were a necessary evil if she ever wanted to live out her dream of becoming a model someday. That day at school was a pretty typical one for Mackenzie. She liked her classes and she loved getting to hang out with her friends at lunch, but she spent a lot of her time daydreaming about graduation and thinking about a time when she'd be able to pursue her goals outside of high school. And to that end, Mackenzie had enrolled at a cosmetology school, or what some people called beauty school, that allowed her to get out of her high school classes a little early every day. Mackenzie wanted to learn how to become a hairstylist and a makeup artist because she believed it could help her in modeling. But Mackenzie also loved the idea of doing something that could help other people look and feel their best. So that afternoon, Mackenzie went into a bathroom, dug her cosmetology school uniform out of her bag, and got changed into black pants, a black shirt, and a black apron, like she did most days during the week. Then she put on her coat and walked outside to her car in the high school parking lot. It was a cold day, a little under 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but Mackenzie's coat and her fur-trimmed brown boots helped keep her warm. Mackenzie hopped into her red Pontiac Grand Prix, tossed her school bag and purse in the passenger seat, and then drove a few miles away to her cosmetology school. When she got there, she parked in the lot behind the school, grabbed her phone from her pocket, and sent a text message to her boyfriend, Joaquin Villasano. Joaquin was a few years older than Mackenzie, and he was busy working most days, so Mackenzie made sure to text him whenever she had a chance just to say hi, because she thought it was important for them to check in with each other even when they were busy. Then Mackenzie put her phone back in her pocket and headed into the school. Once inside, she stepped into a classroom that was set up like a working hair salon, and she gave a huge smile to her instructors and classmates. Mackenzie loved everything she was learning about hair and makeup at the school, but she also really liked having the chance to be around people of all different ages. Some of the students in her cosmetology classes were well into their 20s and even 30s, so Mackenzie felt much more like an adult with real freedom when she was there than she ever did at her high school. And she knew she could learn a lot from the other students because they had different backgrounds and life experiences than she did. One of the students, a 28-year-old man named Chris Wilson, had a mother who owned a salon. And so Chris was already really good at certain techniques like dyeing hair, and Mackenzie loved how Chris dyed his own hair, and so she had started practicing hair dyeing techniques on herself as well. And so every day when Mackenzie left cosmetology school, she felt like she was learning new skills, either from her teachers or from her classmates. And that evening, after another great day at beauty school, Mackenzie drove home, and as she did, she was in a really good mood. So she turned up her car stereo, blared her favorite song, and bobbed her head along with the beat. And as Mackenzie drove down a tree-lined street in her small neighborhood, she was excited about all the opportunities she was sure were going to come her way. Mackenzie pulled up to her mother's 2-story house and parked her car in the driveway. She grabbed her stuff from the passenger seat and then walked inside the house and went straight into the living room. But before she could even put her bags down, her mother's boyfriend walked in and started yelling at her. And any of that joy Mackenzie had felt when she was driving home had now completely disappeared. Mackenzie couldn't even tell what her mother's boyfriend was mad about, other than the fact that she had come home. Because for some reason, her mother's boyfriend did not like Mackenzie. And so Mackenzie just stood there while he shouted at her and got angrier and angrier, until finally Mackenzie told him to leave her alone, and she ran upstairs to her room, sat on her bed, and fought back tears. Then she grabbed her phone and called her dad. Mackenzie split time between her divorced parents' houses, and on the phone she told her dad she couldn't wait to come over to his house the following night. And her dad said when she came over he would cook her a special dinner and make her an ice cream float, which had been her favorite dessert since she was a kid. By the time Mackenzie hung up with her dad, she felt a little better. But while she sat there on her bed, she thought about the argument she'd just had with her mother's boyfriend over seemingly nothing, and she decided she was not going to put up with him anymore. So Mackenzie sat there on her bed for a minute, took a few deep breaths and really psyched herself up. Then she marched downstairs, found her mother, and she told her it was time to make a decision. Mackenzie said her mother could choose either her daughter, or her boyfriend, but she couldn't have both. And Mackenzie said if her mother's boyfriend stayed living at the house, she would move out for good. Her mother listened and tried to calm Mackenzie down, and then she promised she would think about what Mackenzie had to say. But later that night, Mackenzie went to bed without an answer from her mother. But as she drifted off to sleep, she tried to push any thoughts of her mother's boyfriend out of her head. She reminded herself that she was going to her dad's house the next day, and she knew that meant everything would be a lot better when she woke up. The next morning at 7:15 a.m., Mackenzie rushed out the front door of her mother's house and got into her red Pontiac parked in the driveway. Mackenzie wore jeans, a t-shirt, and her coat, and she had her cosmetology school uniform folded up neatly in her bag. And that day at school started just like the day before. Mackenzie walked into the loud cafeteria, where a group of high schoolers were hanging out and talking loudly before first period, and she made her way through the crowd to the table where her friends from the Applettes dance team were sitting. And the Applettes talked a little about the sweatshirts they wanted to make again, and after they'd talked for a while, the bell rang. So Mackenzie said goodbye to her friends and headed off to class. And later that day, she changed into her cosmetology uniform and drove to beauty school. And once she was there, she worked on some new hairstyling techniques and talked with her classmates like she always did. But then, at around 3 p.m., the students got a break, and Mackenzie told one of her classmates that she was going to leave during the break, but she'd only be gone for about 15 minutes, and she wondered if she had to sign out with the front desk before she did that. Her classmate said she didn't think so, and so Mackenzie just grabbed her coat, put it on over her uniform, and walked out the back door into the parking lot. Mackenzie slid into the driver's seat of her car, tossed her purse in the passenger seat, started the car, and turned on the heater. Then she grabbed her phone and sent a text to her boyfriend, Joaquin, that just said, "Hey." Mackenzie stared at her phone for a little bit, waiting for a reply, and just a few minutes later, Joaquin responded with, "Hey," as well. Mackenzie smiled, put her phone back in her pocket, and drove out of the cosmetology school parking lot. It was cold, but the sun was shining, and Mackenzie looked out the windshield and saw the barren apple orchards that lined huge parts of the town. And she thought that the empty orchards in winter were beautiful in their own way, but she really couldn't wait for summer when the apples would start growing again. At about 5:45 p.m., over 2 hours after Mackenzie had left cosmetology school on her break, her dad was at home in the kitchen cooking dinner. He glanced at his watch, picked his phone up off the table, and called Mackenzie. He knew she usually left cosmetology school around 5:30, and he just wanted to let her know dinner was almost finished and to see how close she was to the house. But Mackenzie didn't answer her phone, so he left a message for her and turned back to the food he was making. Mackenzie's dad knew that sometimes she stayed around after class to talk to her teachers and the other students, so he didn't think much of it. But after a while, when Mackenzie didn't show up and he hadn't heard back from her, he called her again. And when her phone went right to voicemail, he started to worry, and so he kept calling Mackenzie, but she never picked up. Then, a little while later, at 8 p.m., so about 4.5 hours after Mackenzie had gotten in her car in the parking lot, a local rancher was driving his truck on a dirt road on the land that he owned. The rancher approached one of his cattle gates on his land, and then he saw something which caused him to slam on his brakes. In the headlights of his truck, the rancher could see an abandoned car a few yards down the road. The rancher got out of his truck and ran to the car and looked through the window to see if anyone was inside, but the car was empty. People did not just abandon their cars like this on his land, and the rancher worried that the driver might be injured somewhere nearby. So he ran back to his truck, climbed in, grabbed his phone, and called 911. Not long after that 911 call, Mackenzie's dad was sitting on the couch in his living room. He was nervously tapping his foot on the floor and calling Mackenzie again and again, but still not getting through. It had been almost 3 hours since she should have come home, and he still hadn't heard anything. And when his daughter's phone went right to voicemail one more time, Mackenzie's dad hung up and just put the phone down next to him. But minutes later, the phone rang, and Mackenzie's dad answered without even looking at the number of the caller, hoping he would hear his daughter's voice. But instead, a police officer introduced himself on the other line, and Mackenzie's dad knew something was terribly wrong. Then the officer asked him if he was missing a red Pontiac Grand Prix that was registered in his name, because that car had been found abandoned on some nearby ranch land. And Mackenzie's dad felt like the room started to spin. He took a breath and told the officer that yes, that was his car and he was missing it, but the car was not important. He said the only thing he cared about was finding the person who had been driving the car, his 17-year-old daughter, Mackenzie. On the morning of February 13th, 2010, so 4 days after Mackenzie's car had been found, police, local volunteers, and even members of the FBI were searching all over town for Mackenzie. They had spent the last few days knocking on doors in every neighborhood in the area, hoping that someone had seen her, but they still hadn't had any luck. And so it seemed like once Mackenzie left the parking lot at her cosmetology school after going for her 15-minute break, she had just vanished. Then, at 12:45 p.m., a man was walking on the banks of the Columbia River, about 25 miles away from Wenatchee, in an area known for its great hiking trails. The man listened to the river running nearby and breathed in the crisp winter air. Then suddenly, he stopped in his tracks. He shielded his eyes from the sun to get a better look at something several yards in front of him by the water's edge. And when the man realized what he was looking at, he immediately started running towards the water and shouting, and when he got to the edge of the water, he crouched down on the ground and just started shaking his head, like he couldn't believe what he was looking at. He had seen a person lying on the ground, and he hoped they were just sleeping, or at worst, they were injured. But now that he was up close, he knew he was looking at a dead body. The man's hands started shaking, and he looked around for anybody else to help, but he was alone. So he took a deep breath and steadied himself, then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and called 911. Not long after that 911 call, Chief Deputy Robin Wagg of the Douglas County Sheriff's Department walked down the banks of the Columbia River towards a group of police officers and forensics technicians. Wagg was a big guy with a steady voice, and he was known for always remaining calm under pressure. But when Wagg saw the body near the river, he got mad, because he knew immediately the victim was 17-year-old Mackenzie Cowell. Mackenzie's picture had been sent to the law enforcement agencies in the area, and her face had been all over the news for the past few days while people had been searching for her. And as Wagg looked down at Mackenzie, he felt shaken, and not just because of how young she looked, but because Mackenzie had a knife sticking straight out of her shoulder. Wagg hadn't seen anything like that before, and he couldn't imagine what kind of a person would do something so violent, especially to someone so young who had her whole life ahead of her. But Wagg couldn't spend any time trying to figure out a potential killer's motives just yet, because he saw Mackenzie's feet were already in the water, and he knew the river level would rise throughout the day, and so the body, and any evidence around it, were in danger of being washed away. So Wagg ordered the team on site to start their search for evidence with the body, and then to make their way outward further away from the water. And so that day, the investigative team worked as quickly as they could as they raced against the rising river. Normally, Wagg would have wanted to inform the victim's family in person, but the time crunch he was under meant he needed to stay at the crime scene. And on top of that, he had to inform FBI agents who'd been helping with the search for Mackenzie about what they had found. And after the FBI was notified, they were the ones to contact Mackenzie's dad. And so while police searched the crime scene, Mackenzie's dad sat at home, and he was still desperately hoping to hear some good news from the search party who were looking for his daughter. But then his phone rang, and an FBI agent on the other line introduced herself and said that she was so sorry to be giving this information over the phone and not in person, and Mackenzie's dad knew before she even said it what he was about to hear. The agent informed Mackenzie's father that police had found his daughter's body on the banks of the river, and Mackenzie's dad just went completely silent, and he felt like his whole world had just shattered. And not long after that call, while Mackenzie's dad informed his fiancée, his ex-wife, and other family members about what he had just heard, police continued their search on the riverbank. And before the river water got too high, they were able to pull blood and hair samples from Mackenzie's body and the knife found in her shoulder. And a little further up the riverbank, they found 5 feet of duct tape that was spattered with blood. So, over the next few days, while the blood samples and physical evidence were sent to the lab for tests, Deputy Wagg and his investigative team started talking to anybody who they thought might know something about what had happened to Mackenzie. They interviewed Mackenzie's family, and they met with friends and teachers from her high school, and at Mackenzie's cosmetology school, they talked to the woman who Mackenzie had told she was leaving for that 15-minute break. And they spoke to Chris Wilson, the man whose mom owned a salon. But all anybody seemed to know was that Mackenzie had gone out to the parking lot for this break and then just never came back. But then a woman contacted the police and told them that she thought she had seen a thin, dark-haired young man walking away from Mackenzie's red Pontiac Grand Prix not long after it had been abandoned. But that description could fit a wide range of people. So, Wag shifted his search from Mackenzie's school life to her life online to see if he could narrow down his search for this thin, dark-haired young man. And so, detectives began looking at Mackenzie's social media pages on sites like Facebook and MySpace, and Mackenzie's social media posts led police right to a young man who fit the witness's description, Mackenzie's boyfriend, Joaquin Villasano. On an early morning, about a week after Mackenzie's body was found on the banks of the Columbia River, Chief Deputy Wag walked through the Douglas County Sheriff's Department into a small interrogation room. Wag watched as a technician wrapped a blood pressure cuff around Joaquin Villasano's arm to prep him for a polygraph, or lie detector test. Joaquin was thin with dark hair, and he wore a t-shirt and jeans. And under the bright fluorescent lights overhead, Wag could see that Joaquin was visibly nervous. Then, Wag entered the room and took a seat next to several officers who were already inside there. In the days following the discovery of Mackenzie's body, different law enforcement agencies had come together to form a task force for the murder investigation. And so now, Wag and other investigators from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department were joined by members of the Wenatchee Police, the Washington State Police, and the FBI. And all of them were eager to hear what Mackenzie's boyfriend, Joaquin, had to say. The room got quiet, and then, in a calm voice, the investigator leading Joaquin's polygraph test asked if Joaquin was a gangster, because they had seen social media posts that supposedly celebrated gang behavior. But Joaquin said no. He just really loved hip-hop music, and some of his favorite artists talked about gang life in their songs. Then the investigator asked if Joaquin had met up with Mackenzie after they exchanged text messages on the day she died. But Joaquin said after he had sent the response text just saying, "Hey," he never heard from or saw Mackenzie again. Wag noticed that almost every time Joaquin answered a question, he looked down at the floor, and Wag knew that could be a sign that Joaquin was lying or trying to avoid the question. But Wag also thought this kid might just be painfully shy. Then finally, the investigator asked Joaquin if he had killed Mackenzie, and Joaquin said no. He said he loved her. But by the end of the session, investigators still weren't sure what to make of Joaquin. Several answers he'd given had been inconclusive on the polygraph test, so there was a chance that he'd told several lies. But Wag and the others didn't want to condemn Joaquin without conclusive proof, and so far, all they really had was the text message that Joaquin had sent in response to Mackenzie's text on the day that she had died. And neither of those text messages were substantive. They just said, "Hey." And so investigators knew they had to find something more concrete than that if they wanted to hold Joaquin, but Joaquin's interrogation and conversations with some of Mackenzie's friends and family led them to another potential suspect, because almost all of the people police talked to had pointed them to someone who they said Mackenzie fought with all the time. And so, as the investigation moved forward, Wag started to think that maybe Mackenzie's boyfriend was not the killer. However, maybe Mackenzie's mother's boyfriend was. About a week after Mackenzie's body had been discovered, Wag and other members of the task force started to look deeper into the relationship Mackenzie had with her mother's boyfriend. And almost everything they found out made it clear that Mackenzie and her mother's boyfriend argued a lot. And then, Mackenzie's dad told investigators that the night before Mackenzie had gone missing, she had given her mother an ultimatum and said her mother had to choose between Mackenzie and her boyfriend. So, on a cold February afternoon, investigators went to Mackenzie's mother's house. But when they met with the boyfriend, it was a quick conversation. He admitted he and Mackenzie did not get along, but he said he would never do anything to hurt her. And he said he was nowhere near Mackenzie at the time she was murdered, and that multiple people could vouch for his whereabouts. And when Wag followed up on his alibi, it checked out. Still, Wag was not ready to write off any potential suspects just yet. But after meeting Mackenzie's mother's boyfriend, Wag still thought Mackenzie's own boyfriend, Joaquin, seemed like a much stronger lead. And the test results that came back from the lab confirmed that genetic material found on that knife in Mackenzie's arm and on the blood-spattered duct tape belonged to a male. And the violent nature of the attack led Wag to believe it had been carried out by someone who knew Mackenzie and that it could have been a crime of passion. And so Wag felt like he was still on the right path with Joaquin. On February 25, 2010, over 2 weeks after Mackenzie's murder, 1,800 people filled the stands of the arena where the local hockey team played. They had all come together to celebrate Mackenzie's life at a public memorial service. The owner of the hockey team had paid for the entire service and had made sure that the ice on the hockey rink was covered with a floor so Mackenzie's dance team, the Applettes, could perform a routine in her honor. And at the end of that dance routine, all of the dancers hugged and cried. And none of them could believe that their friend Mackenzie, who loved dancing as much as they did, would never get to perform with them ever again. And during that memorial service, members of the audience were very moved by that dance performance and the effect it had on the dancers. They saw how emotional they were getting. And so the audience got really upset and angry, and a lot of the people in attendance decided they needed to do something to help find Mackenzie's killer. So, in the weeks following the memorial, business leaders in the community came together and started a reward fund, offering almost $40,000 to anyone who had information that led police to the person who had committed this horrific crime. Chief Deputy Wag hoped the reward might bring someone forward who had been unwilling to talk to police before. And he hoped someone would be able to shed light on new evidence because he still didn't have enough to link Joaquin to Mackenzie's murder, and he really had no other viable suspects. But then, in early April, over a month after the memorial, a call came in to the police that would turn the entire investigation on its head. In early April, about 2 months after Mackenzie's murder, Chief Deputy Wag was sitting at his desk when a fellow officer rushed in looking very excited. And the officer told Wag that they had just gotten a call from a woman who said she knew exactly who killed Mackenzie and how they had done it. So Wag took down the woman's information and quickly set up an interview with her. Her name was Liz Reed, and she was a low-level drug dealer who had worked as a police informant in the past to help police catch bigger drug traffickers in the area. And so not long after Wag contacted her, Liz came to the station. And when Wag and other members of the task force sat across from her in the interrogation room, they were blown away by what they heard. Liz told them that 2 major dealers she knew had bragged to her about being the ones who had killed Mackenzie Cowell. But she said that wasn't all, because these dealers had made Liz watch a video, what they called a snuff film, that actually showed Mackenzie's murder. And then Liz gave police another piece of evidence that she said would make it clear that these drug dealers were really the killers. She said that after they forced her to watch this snuff film, they had sent her out to the banks of the Columbia River, close to where Mackenzie's body had been found, and the dealers had told Liz that they needed to find a ring that had fallen off of Mackenzie's finger by the river when they had killed her. Liz told police she had gone searching for the ring, but she couldn't find it. After meeting with Liz, Wag and the other investigators shifted their focus from Mackenzie's boyfriend Joaquin to the drug dealers Liz had mentioned. Wag was not going to just take Liz at her word, but she had been a good police informant in the past, so he at least considered her story credible. And so, with all of the details Liz had provided, investigators set out to track down the drug dealers, to find the ring Liz had mentioned, and to locate the snuff film she said would prove who killed Mackenzie. And it turned out that finding the drug dealers was not that hard. They were well known by police in the area, and so not long after talking to Liz, investigators questioned them. But not surprisingly to the police, the dealers denied everything, and they claimed to have no idea who Mackenzie was, other than what they had seen on the news. But police were not ready to just accept the word of 2 known drug dealers, so they continued to pursue this new lead. And on April 20th, over 2 months after Mackenzie's murder, several members of the investigative team were back on the banks of the Columbia River. They were combing the area around where Mackenzie's body had been found, looking for the ring Liz had told them about. But it had been months since the murder, and the depth of the river water fluctuated so much. So officers worried that if they really had missed something as important as a ring the first time around, it would have been washed away by now. But the officers walked up and down the banks, searching every inch of land, and at times one of them would get down on the ground and dig through rocks and dirt where they thought they might have found something, but each time the excitement quickly disappeared when they realized they had not found the ring. Then, suddenly, one of the officers stopped in his tracks. He thought the sunlight had bounced off of something near his feet. He knew it most likely was a rock, like all the other times he thought he had found the ring, but he wanted to make sure. So he got down on the ground and moved his eyes across the dirt, but at first he couldn't see anything. Then the sun shined just right again, and something caught his eye, and he bent down even further and started digging the dirt away, and his eyes lit up, because he was staring at a ring just like the one the police informant Liz had described. And later that day, when Chief Deputy Wag and other task force leaders got a look at this new evidence, they thought they might finally have something that would prove who killed Mackenzie. And so Wag and a member of the Wenatchee Police Department took the ring and drove all over town. And they showed it to Mackenzie's parents, her family, and her friends from high school and cosmetology school, but not one of them recognized the ring. So Wag took one final step, and he went directly to the young man who had been his prime suspect, Mackenzie's boyfriend, Joaquin. But Joaquin looked at the ring over and over again, and he said he'd never seen Mackenzie wear anything like it. And all of a sudden, this piece of evidence that had looked so promising proved to be yet another dead end. But even though nobody in Mackenzie's life recognized that ring, investigators still didn't give up on the drug dealer angle. In fact, they spent months following the lead they'd received from their informant Liz, but they could never find any connection between these supposed killers and Mackenzie, and the horrific snuff film Liz had told them about never surfaced. And then finally, months after Liz had first contacted police, she told them she had made the entire story up. There was no snuff film, the ring had been planted on the beach, and the drug dealers had nothing to do with Mackenzie's murder. Months later, Liz would try to go back again on her story and claim she was actually telling the truth about the drug dealers having killed Mackenzie, but the damage to her credibility was done, and so police refused to listen to her. And so, by July of 2010, 5 months after Mackenzie's murder, Wag and other investigators felt like they had lost valuable time and spent valuable resources pursuing a lead that was very likely a lie. They believed Liz was just a desperate informant who was either trying to deflect from her own drug crimes or who badly wanted that $40,000 reward money for information that led to Mackenzie's killer. And so, Wag kept trying to move the investigation forward, but the summer heat and the return of the apples to the orchards made it clear to him just how long the search for Mackenzie's killer was taking. And he knew people in town, and everybody who loved Mackenzie, were giving up hope. But then, investigators got another call from a police informant, and unlike Liz, they still trusted this informant. And the call they got from him would lead investigators to a new key piece of evidence, and they would finally find Mackenzie's killer. Based on the call from this new informant, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and physical evidence found at multiple locations, here is a reconstruction of what members of the investigation task force believe happened to Mackenzie Cowell on the day she died, February 9th, 2010. On that February day, a few minutes after 3:45 p.m., the killer followed Mackenzie's car into the parking lot of an apartment complex. The killer watched Mackenzie step out of the car holding her purse, and immediately, a look of complete calm came across the killer's face. Then, the killer stepped out of the car, put a smile on, and called out to Mackenzie. Mackenzie turned around, she waved and smiled, and walked right over to them. Then, the killer led Mackenzie up a flight of stairs and into a small one-bedroom apartment. Mackenzie walked into the living room that was kind of cramped, put her purse down on the coffee table, and then she smiled even wider at the killer. The place wasn't much to look at with its old carpet, low ceilings, and a few small rooms, but Mackenzie got excited thinking about a time in the near future when she would be able to get an apartment just like this one, where she could live on her own or with one of her friends. The killer said they were going to grab a glass of water in the kitchen and they'd be right back. And so Mackenzie just stood in the living room, daydreaming again about the freedom she'd get to experience once she graduated from high school. In the kitchen, the killer turned on the sink to let the water run, but instead of getting a cup of water, they opened a drawer, took out a roll of duct tape, and put it on the counter. Then they opened another drawer and looked at all the knives inside, and one knife caught their eye. It was a kitchen knife with a sharp blade and a sleek black and gray handle, something that a chef might use. So the killer reached into the drawer, took that knife out, and held it up in front of them. And just feeling the knife grip in their hand got the killer excited. But they took a breath and kept that look of complete calm on their face. Then the killer turned off the water, picked up the duct tape, held the knife down by their side, and walked back into the living room. The killer saw Mackenzie looking around the room with her back turned to them. And so the killer leaned over and put the duct tape and the knife on a coffee table not far from Mackenzie, and when Mackenzie turned to see what the killer was doing, the killer suddenly lunged at her and shoved her down. Mackenzie fell backwards and slammed her head into the carpeted floor, and immediately the killer climbed on top of her and wrapped their hands around her throat. Mackenzie tried to scream, but the life was being choked out of her, and she could feel herself drifting out of consciousness. Then the killer released Mackenzie's throat, but stayed on top of her to keep her pinned down. The killer reached back behind them, grabbed the duct tape from the table, ripped off a long piece, and quickly bound Mackenzie's hands with it. Mackenzie tried to fight back, but she could barely move. Then the killer reached back to the table again, grabbed the knife, and slashed Mackenzie's throat. Blood spilled from Mackenzie onto the carpet, and she took her last breath. The killer stood over Mackenzie for a minute, just watching her die, and then when she went still, they raised the knife and slammed it into her shoulder, and then began trying to saw her arm off. But the knife wasn't made for that, and the killer realized they didn't have the time or supplies to do exactly what they had wanted. So the killer left the knife in Mackenzie's shoulder, and they went back to the kitchen and washed the blood off their hands and face. Then they walked back through the apartment, grabbed Mackenzie's purse, darted outside to the parking lot, and walked to Mackenzie's red Pontiac. The killer dug through Mackenzie's purse, found her car keys, and got into the car, fired it up. Then they drove that car outside of town onto a secluded dirt road by a ranch. Once they had parked the car, the killer got outside and calmly walked back down the road as the sun started to set. And they walked several miles back to their apartment, and by the time they got back, it was dark outside, and inside, Mackenzie's body was still on the floor. And days later, the killer drove Mackenzie's body, with the knife still sticking out of it, to the banks of the Columbia River and left it there. And a few days after that, the killer told the cosmetology school they attended that they would be taking a leave of absence. Chris Wilson, Mackenzie's classmate at beauty school, whose mother owned a salon, had murdered Mackenzie and then attempted to dismember her. He tried to cut off her arm, but realized he couldn't, and so just kind of stopped. And in terms of Chris's motive, all we know is that Chris was totally obsessed with death, serial killers, and movie murderers. And he showed off this obsession with death with his tattoo of Hannibal Lecter, the killer cannibal from the movie Silence of the Lambs. Chris had even spent time working at a funeral home, likely because he loved being around dead bodies, but he had been fired because the funeral director said that Chris had started to do some things that made the rest of the staff feel very uncomfortable. But none of this was known to Chief Deputy Wag and the investigation task force until they received the call from that second police informant. This informant was in jail, but he hoped providing information about Mackenzie's killer might help him with his own case. So he contacted police and told them that Chris was one of Mackenzie's cosmetology school classmates and that Chris was actually very dangerous and was totally obsessed with murder. And after the police got this call, they met with Chris, and they saw Chris's dyed black hair and thin frame, and they knew he fit the description from the witness who had seen a dark-haired, thin young man walking away from Mackenzie's abandoned car. And then police checked security camera footage of the cosmetology school from the day of Mackenzie's murder, and on one of the videos, Chris could be seen leaving the school and heading into the parking lot about a minute after Mackenzie was seen leaving on the video. And so with all of this new information, investigators asked Chris to submit to a DNA test, and those test results showed Chris had possible links to the genetic material found on the knife used to stab Mackenzie and on the blood-spattered duct tape found near Mackenzie's body. And DNA testing would also provide police with the piece of evidence that ultimately turned the case around, because when they searched Chris's apartment, police found a blood stain deep in the living room carpet, and tests done on that piece of carpet showed that the blood belonged to Mackenzie. And police heard from other cosmetology school students that Chris and Mackenzie might have been developing a relationship, which is why she would have been comfortable going to his apartment. Then, police found pictures on Chris's phone that he had taken of his female friend posing as a dead body in his living room right on the spot where Mackenzie's blood had been found, and so investigators were certain that Chris was the killer. Investigators believed they had proven beyond a doubt that Chris committed first-degree murder, but the district attorney had reservations because there was no clear-cut evidence that placed Chris in the apartment at the time of Mackenzie's murder and no evidence that Chris actually drove Mackenzie's body to the river. And so Chris was able to sign a plea deal in which he confessed to killing Mackenzie, and in exchange for that confession, he was only charged with manslaughter and sentenced to just 14 years in prison with a potential early release in 2023. It was past midnight in June of 2020 in Sandusky, Ohio, and 25-year-old Lauren Wells lay in her bed wide awake. She had to be up early for work, and had been trying to fall asleep for hours, but all night long, the faint sound of music coming from her upstairs neighbors had made sleep impossible. The tune they kept playing was extremely irritating. Sometimes it was very generic sounding, like elevator music. Then it seemed to switch to some kind of strange experimental jazz. Lauren had just moved into her apartment and didn't want to cause any trouble with her new neighbors, but they clearly were not stopping anytime soon. So she finally climbed out of bed and grabbed her broom. She was just about to knock on the ceiling with her broom when the direction of the music suddenly changed. Now it sounded like it was coming from next door. Lauren shook her head in frustration. She didn't want to start a fight with the entire complex, so she climbed back into her bed and threw her pillow over her head. She could still hear the music, but eventually she drifted off to sleep. The next morning at 8 a.m., Lauren arrived at her job as a nursing home administrator. She had just been hired 2 months ago, and she was proud that she'd gotten this position at such a young age. Running the nursing home was Lauren's dream job. She loved interacting with the elderly residents and wanted to make a difference in their lives. So even though she was running on fumes at this point from a lack of sleep, Lauren pushed through the day, checking in on staff and residents, and running various meetings. Thankfully, it was a Friday, so Lauren had the weekend to look forward to. She and her friends were heading to one of the islands off of Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes. Lauren hoped some time outdoors would help her regain some energy. And the weekend getaway was just what she needed. The sun was out, there was a gentle breeze over the lake, and the water was cool and refreshing. Lauren was excited to reconnect with her best friends, and on their first night out, they went out to dance and have some drinks. She forgot about work and her annoying neighbors and just enjoyed herself. But as the evening progressed, Lauren found herself using the bathroom more than usual, but she figured it was just because she was drinking. A little while later, when she was on the dance floor, she felt a sharp pain on her left side. The pain stayed with her the rest of the night. She thought it was menstrual cramps and did her best to ignore them. Nothing was going to stop her from having a fun weekend. And by the time she got home Sunday night, she was feeling better, just like she had hoped. But soon after Lauren stepped into her apartment, her good mood evaporated. Her neighbors were playing that annoying elevator music again. The faint melodies seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lauren dropped her bags and shook her head. She wasn't going to let this upset her. It was late and she knew she needed to get some sleep. So she unpacked and got ready for bed. But just like before, it was impossible to relax with that music coming through the walls. She tossed and turned for hours until finally exhaustion overtook her. When Monday morning rolled around, Lauren was definitely not feeling well. She figured she was paying for her weekend of partying, so she tried to shake it off. She made herself a cup of coffee and got on the treadmill for her daily run. But she'd only been on the treadmill for a minute when once again she felt an intense pain in her left side and had to stop running. It almost felt like someone was punching her hard, but from the inside. This pain went far beyond menstrual cramps. She figured something else had to be going on. Lauren thought back to everything she did at Lake Erie. She wondered if she had pulled a muscle while she was out swimming. It didn't seem likely, but she couldn't think of anything else that would explain the pain. Lauren had no idea how she was going to get through the day, much less the week, but she didn't want to call in sick. She was still new to her job, and people were counting on her. So she slowly got dressed while wincing in pain and got ready for work. And as she did, she thought to herself, at least her neighbors weren't playing that god-awful music. Once Lauren arrived at work, she did her morning rounds and sat down at her desk to take care of some paperwork. But as hard as she tried, she just couldn't focus. There was something distracting her. It was that weird music she kept hearing in her apartment. It made no sense that the same music would be playing in the nursing home. Lauren looked around just to see if there were any speakers nearby, but there was none. She tried to ignore the disjointed melody, but it was impossible. It seemed like it was coming from everywhere. But then she realized something that made her heart start racing. If there really wasn't any music actually playing right now, that could only mean one thing. The music was only happening in her head. She wondered if she was going crazy. But before she jumped to any conclusions, Lauren thought of someone who might be able to help her. She had a friend who was an audiologist, which is a doctor that specializes in hearing. Lauren called her right away and explained what was going on. She described the strange, repetitive sound and said it was following her everywhere. Lauren's friend listened patiently, then told her that what she was describing sounded upsetting, but it actually wasn't uncommon. She promised that Lauren was not going crazy. She said that sometimes people can hear melodies in everyday noises, like busy traffic or the hum of air conditioners, and just like songs that get stuck in your head, these sounds can do the same thing. Since Lauren was clearly so tired, she was probably more susceptible to hearing these noises. Her friend was sure that once Lauren just got some quality sleep, this weird music she was hearing would go away. Lauren was relieved, but also frustrated. The music was actually the thing keeping her from sleeping in the first place. But she was glad to know that if she could just get some rest, maybe her life would go back to normal. As the week went by, Lauren did her best to stay relaxed, but the music in her head just would not stop, and it continued to make sleep nearly impossible. And so a few days after talking to her friend, Lauren again dragged herself to work, and as she headed down the hall toward her office, she noticed a new odd sensation. Her hands felt like they were covered in a thick layer of dirt, and they felt sticky too, almost as if a glue stick had melted in her palm. She kept scrubbing her hands with soap and hot water, but she couldn't get them to feel clean. Lauren was totally confused. She'd never felt anything like this before. And it wasn't long before that same sensation spread to her feet. Lauren felt like her socks were glued to her toes. At first, it was just a little bit irritating, but then it became totally unbearable. She started going barefoot at work, which helped a little bit. She realized it was weird, but she couldn't stand the thought of putting her shoes and socks back on. Lauren was afraid that there was a connection between her auditory hallucinations and now her hands and feet feeling dirty all the time. But she had no idea what that connection could be. Lauren's instinct was telling her to go see a doctor, but she imagined how ridiculous it would all sound. She hung on to what her friend, the audiologist, had told her about feeling better with some rest. And so Lauren convinced herself that this was the weekend she would finally get some sleep and all these problems would just finally go away. That Saturday night, more than 2 weeks after her strange symptoms had begun, Lauren climbed into bed exhausted. She tried to ignore the strange soundtrack playing in her head, her sticky hands and feet, and the dull pain still in her left side. She pulled the comforter up to her chin, and she tried to meditate, letting the sounds of birds outside her window lull her to sleep. But after a few minutes, Lauren's eyes flew open. She realized that the birds singing outside her window were seagulls. Seagulls live near water, and there was not an ocean or a lake anywhere near her. The seagulls got louder and louder, and finally sounded like they might just fly right into her room at any second. Lauren knew that no amount of rest was going to make them go away, because just like the music, these squawking seagulls were in her head. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see a doctor. Almost 500 miles away in Easton, Pennsylvania, Lauren's father, Brad, was sound asleep at home when his phone rang. He saw Lauren's name on the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. She wouldn't be calling so late if something wasn't wrong. After he answered the phone, Lauren told him what had been going on for the past couple of weeks. She had reached the point where she was so worried about her symptoms that she was heading to the emergency room to get checked out. Brad could hear the panic in her voice, and that made him scared. He was fully awake now, calculating how long it would take him to drive to Ohio. He jumped out of bed and reached for his clothes, telling Lauren he was on his way, but she told him he should stay home. She wanted to see what the doctor had to say before he made such a long trip. Brad reluctantly agreed to hold off, but he told Lauren to call as soon as she had any answers. 30 minutes after talking to her father, Lauren arrived at the emergency room. She took a breath and then described her symptoms to the admissions nurse, expecting to get some strange looks. But the nurse just nodded and took some notes. Then Lauren was sent back to see a doctor, who performed an exam and drew her blood. Lauren waited anxiously as they processed her results. and after a little while, the doctor approached Lauren's hospital bed. She searched his face, looking for any sign of concern, but his expression seemed totally relaxed. He told Lauren that her tests were completely normal. He didn't think anything was really wrong with her. As he spoke, he flipped through her chart and asked about her work. She explained she'd recently moved and started a new job. The doctor nodded and said he understood, and he said, Lauren, you're probably just stressed. And then he prescribed her some anti-anxiety medication, and he gave her an order to see a psychiatrist. Lauren was frustrated with the doctor's diagnosis, but he seemed to be certain there wasn't anything else going on with her. So Lauren left the ER feeling somewhat unsettled, and on the way home, she called her father, Brad. Lauren could always rely on him to be supportive and honest with her. She told him how annoyed she was that all these doctors just assumed she was stressed because of her new job. But she was thriving there and loved the new challenge. It didn't make sense to put the blame solely on stress. Her dad said he totally understood her frustration, but the doctors knew what they were doing. He asked Lauren to at least start taking the anti-anxiety medication. With any luck, they'd let her get some sleep, and then at that point, with a clear head, she could reassess her situation. Lauren was not convinced, but she promised her dad that she would try. Later that week, Lauren drove to work as usual. She'd been taking her anxiety medication, but so far, it really wasn't helping. She still heard all the mysterious music playing everywhere she went, and so she really wasn't getting more than an hour or two of sleep at night. She gulped down some strong black coffee, but nothing could cut through her brain fog. She'd been a zombie at work all week, often losing track of what she was supposed to be doing. Lauren turned into the parking lot, pulled into her parking spot, and then got out of her car, and as she walked towards the building, she left the engine running and her keys in the ignition, and her laptop and purse were still on the passenger seat. Lauren entered the conference room in a daze. She felt like she was moving in slow motion, and she barely registered the team of nurses who were already there for the weekly staff meeting. Lauren sat down at the table and tried to read the agenda, but the words looked like a jumble of hieroglyphics. At some point, Lauren tried to say something, but nothing came out of her mouth. She looked at the faces of her colleagues, who were now staring at her in confusion, and suddenly, Lauren realized she had no idea how she had gotten there or what she was supposed to do. The nurses who were at the meeting with Lauren could tell something was wrong with her. They helped Lauren lie down on a nearby sofa and took her blood pressure, which was extremely high. She could hear another nurse calling 911. Lauren tried not to panic, but the fear was overwhelming. Then her mind went totally blank. By the time the ambulance arrived, Lauren was starting to come out of her trance-like state. The fog that had been clouding her mind had lifted, and she felt more clear-headed than she had in a long time. She insisted that she did not need to go to the hospital, but the staff wouldn't hear of it. And so, after some gentle coaxing, they convinced Lauren to get in the ambulance. The paramedics took Lauren to a local hospital where doctors ran a series of tests. As she waited for the results, she felt surprisingly calm. She was so relaxed that she began texting her friends to come hang out with her in the hospital. She said she was having a great time. Lauren's friends were taken aback by these text messages. They knew what she was going through, and this just didn't sound like her at all. A little while later, Lauren's father, Brad, was busy at work when his cell phone rang. He'd been on edge the whole week, worrying about his daughter. When he saw it wasn't her number, he felt relieved. But then he realized the person calling him had an area code from Sandusky, the town where Lauren lived. Brad's stomach tightened as he answered. It was one of Lauren's friends. She told Brad that Lauren was in the hospital and that she was not doing well. This time, Brad didn't hesitate. He raced home, threw some clothes in a suitcase, and sped off to make the 7-hour drive to Sandusky. Meanwhile, Lauren was waiting at the hospital for more test results. One of her close friends, who had come to the ER, was sitting next to her. When the doctor came back to Lauren, he gave her some good news. Her test results had all come back negative, just like before. They couldn't explain what had happened to her at work, but physically she was fine and she could be discharged. Lauren thanked him, then she turned to her friend and said that it must have been another false alarm. But Lauren could tell her friend still looked worried. And deep in her heart, Lauren knew she wasn't okay, no matter what these tests said. Her symptoms might have temporarily gone away, but they were going to return, and as she thought about that, she began to feel this terrible dread come over her. Lauren asked the doctor if there was any other alternative to being discharged. The doctor hesitated, and then he said yes, there was, but it was drastic. Seven hours later, Brad finally arrived at the hospital in Sandusky, and he raced to the admissions desk. Just moments earlier, his daughter had called him with the stunning news that she was admitting herself into the psychiatric ward of the hospital. And so Brad, all he wanted to do was just get to his daughter. Once he entered the patient area, Brad was greeted by a doctor and brought to Lauren's room. But he was only allowed to see her through a shatterproof glass window on her locked door, and what he saw shook him to the core. Lauren was writhing on the floor, screaming and begging to be let out. She was trying to tear off her shirt. Food was splattered on the walls, and an empty tray and plate were upside down on the floor. Brad was stunned. Lauren had called him just a couple of hours earlier and seemed fairly clear-headed, and so he didn't understand how her condition could have changed so drastically. The doctor explained that he was giving Lauren medicine to treat schizophrenia, which is a serious mental disorder that causes people to hallucinate and experience delusions. They'd already started on her medication, but it would need time to take effect. Brad shook his head in disbelief. There was no history of mental illness in their family, and Lauren had always been so happy and well-adjusted. The doctor could only shrug. Schizophrenia did have a tendency to run in families, but it also struck out of the blue, usually in young adults anytime between their late teens and early 20s, and Lauren was 25. The diagnosis was terrifying. Brad was desperate to do something to help, but all he could do was wait for Lauren's medication to kick in. It was early in the morning when Brad left the hospital after Lauren had finally calmed down. He checked into a nearby hotel and sank into an exhausted sleep, thinking about his daughter and praying that she would be back to her normal self by the time he woke up. After sleeping for a few hours, Brad returned to the hospital, and when he got there, the nurse gave him a rundown of Lauren's condition. She said Lauren had begged the staff to use their hospital phone, and then when they said yes, she had called friends and relatives repeatedly, forgetting she'd already spoken with them. She'd also become very aggressive with the hospital staff. Brad insisted on going into his daughter's room, so they unlocked her door and he walked in softly, not wanting to scare her. Lauren was sitting on a rumpled bed staring into the distance. Her hair was disheveled and there were dark circles under her eyes. He almost didn't even recognize her. Brad struggled to stay calm as he sat down next to Lauren. He tried to comfort her and asked her if she needed anything, but she didn't respond. The medications she was on didn't seem to be working, but the doctor said it could take a while to kick in. Without anything else to hold on to, Brad clung on to that hope. Over the next few days, Brad anxiously waited for Lauren to improve as doctors tried different combinations of medications. But on the fifth night after Lauren was admitted to the psych ward, things got even worse. Brad had gone back to his hotel, and in a routine that had become too familiar, a phone call startled him awake. It was someone from the hospital. Lauren had experienced a massive seizure and was being transferred to the ICU for further testing. Brad ran to his car, and by the time he arrived at the ICU, Lauren was heavily sedated. He flagged down a doctor in the hall and bombarded her with questions, but it was clear that the doctor was just as much in the dark as he was. All she knew was that Lauren was in critical condition, and they were trying to figure out what was wrong. Afterward, in the waiting room, Brad called friends and family to update them. He tried to piece together everything that had happened to her in the last several weeks, hunting for any clues that might explain her illness, but all he had was a long list of strange symptoms and events. Brad didn't know what to do, but he was desperate for answers, and so he began mentally going through his list of friends who might have some perspective that could be useful right now about Lauren. And as he did this, one name came up that he and Lauren both had in common: Ken Zemanek. Ken was the father of twin girls who were Lauren's best friends from childhood, and he was also a psychiatrist. And so Brad hoped Ken could provide some perspective about Lauren's mental state. When he got Ken on the phone, Brad was afraid that Ken would tell him the same things as all the other doctors, that it was possible Lauren had schizophrenia, or that Brad just needed to be patient and wait for more test results. But once Brad finished going through Lauren's extensive list of strange symptoms, Ken didn't say a word. After a long pause, he said that the hallucinations and mood swings did point to a mental issue. But what troubled Ken was the seizure. Schizophrenia couldn't have caused that to happen. Ken paused again, and then told Brad he did have another thought, one that could potentially explain everything that had been happening to Lauren. He described it as a, quote, rare bird, or extremely rare condition. He suggested that Brad ask Lauren's doctors to test her for this rare condition. Brad listened intently. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. After Brad hung up with Ken, Brad Googled anything he could find about this rare disease Ken had mentioned. And the more he read about it, the more convinced he became that it was what was happening to Lauren. Brad headed straight to the nurse's station and asked to speak with one of Lauren's doctors right away. For the first time since Lauren's nightmare had started, he felt a real glimmer of hope. The on-duty doctor arrived, and Brad told him about his conversation with Ken Zemanek, but the doctor was hesitant to test for it right away. The condition Brad described was incredibly unusual, and they needed to test for more common conditions first. Brad immediately tried speaking with another one of Lauren's doctors to see if maybe they would test for it, but that doctor said the same thing. They were going to test for common things first. And this doctor would say that in their entire career, they had never seen a patient with something that rare before. And so a parade of specialists marched in and out of Lauren's room, but every test they ran was inconclusive. As the hours ticked by, Brad's frustration grew. The next morning, Brad arrived at the hospital and headed straight to the ICU. As he walked down the hallway leading to Lauren's room, he heard a commotion of voices and the sound of beeping monitors. He ran into his daughter's room and saw a team of doctors hovering over Lauren. She was lying motionless on the bed and her eyes were closed. Brad stood there in shocked silence until a doctor noticed him and rushed over. He told Brad that Lauren's vital signs were dropping and they were working to get her stabilized. And so Brad needed to leave and go to the waiting area until the situation was under control. But Brad was sick of waiting in a medical twilight zone. His daughter was on the verge of death and they still had no idea what was wrong with her. He demanded they run the tests that he had requested about this rare illness. The doctor hesitated, but then nodded. He finally admitted that they were hitting a total brick wall and were at an absolute loss. But they were at a small community hospital, and so their resources were very limited to both test and treat Lauren for this rare condition if she were to have it. And so if Brad wanted to get her the help she needed, they'd have to transfer her to the Cleveland clinic, which was over an hour away. However, getting there was a huge risk. Lauren was so weak she could die on the transit. Brad was facing the biggest decision of his life, but he didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, Lauren was loaded into the back of an ambulance, headed for the Cleveland clinic. Brad followed behind in his car, praying his daughter could hold on just a little longer. When the ambulance finally arrived at the clinic, a medical team was waiting. Brad quickly parked his car and joined them as the team grabbed the gurney that Lauren was on and rushed her towards the entrance. Brad tried to stay calm as he watched them wheel her to the neurological ICU. Lauren's heartbeat barely registered, and she was having trouble breathing on her own. The doctors told Brad that her brain had also begun to swell, and so they needed to put her into a medically induced coma to help bring the swelling down. Lauren was given a strong sedative through an IV drip to put her into a state of unconsciousness. She was then hooked up to a ventilator that went into her mouth and down her throat to keep her breathing, and a feeding tube was inserted inside her nose and down into her stomach. Brad tried not to show how scared he was. but he knew Lauren was hanging on by a thread. Brad spent the next several hours anxiously pacing in the lobby of the ICU while the heads of several departments at the Cleveland Clinic teamed up in an attempt to save Lauren's life. Finally, one of Lauren's doctors walked in with the results of Lauren's newest round of tests. The doctor was incredulous. Brad and his good friend, Ken Zemanek, had been right. Lauren was sick with something that was so unheard of, most doctors would never think to even test for it. She had a disease called anti-NMDAR encephalitis. Anti-NMDAR is extremely rare, affecting only 1 out of 1.5 million people per year. It had only been identified 13 years earlier in 2007. The disease causes severe inflammation of the brain, which then results in hallucinations and a total psychotic breakdown. This explained almost all of Lauren's symptoms, like hearing the strange music and the seagulls and the sticky feelings on her hands and feet. But it turned out that NMDAR by itself wasn't what caused Lauren to get so sick. The doctor explained that the disease usually signified a deeper, even rarer underlying condition, which would have caused Lauren's other symptoms, like the pain in her side and the frequent need to urinate. Those symptoms were caused by a tumor in her ovary called a teratoma. Teratomas usually strike young women. This kind of tumor is made up of tissue from other parts of the body, like hair, muscle, nerve, organ, or bone. Normally, when the immune system recognizes a tumor in the body, it creates antibodies to try and kill it off. However, the specific type of antibodies formed from a teratoma can end up targeting more than just the tumor. They can also attack the brain and cause anti-NMDAR. In trying to defend her body against this tumor, Lauren's brain had accidentally attacked itself. Brad nearly collapsed from relief. They had a clear-cut answer for what Lauren was up against. It meant they weren't working in the dark. Now they just needed to get the tumor out. A surgeon removed the teratoma the next morning. It was 13 centimeters long, so more than 5 inches long. And unfortunately, it was malignant, which meant Lauren needed chemotherapy in order to fully recover. For the next 2 weeks, Lauren stayed in a medically induced coma. Once she was finally awakened, she couldn't remember anything that had happened to her. She had to relearn how to walk and how to talk, but day by day she got stronger and was finally well enough to go home. 6 months later, Lauren got the news they'd all been hoping for. She was now officially cancer-free. After a full recovery, she went on to graduate from school and earned an advanced degree. Then, in April of 2022, she took a new job as executive director of a senior living facility. She never heard phantom elevator music or seagulls again.
She walked through shadows deep and long, cold nights where things went wrong. Now she stands in morning light, eyes so bright, future in sight. Scars of past, they fade away. New dawn brings a better day. Heartbeats echo, hope inside. Wings of dreams, now they glide. On she flies above the pain, dancing in a golden rain. No more tears, no more night. She's the star that's burning bright. Steps were hard, but now they sing. Every path new chances bring. Lost and found her way again. Strength she found through all the pain. Future calls remain so clear. No more doubts, no more fear.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Steve Chivers. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak, Natalie Bettendorf, and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomanang. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villapondo. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Senior producers are Laura Donna Polivoda, Dave Schilling, and Matt Olmos. Our executive producer